David, who are you?
You can't open it like that. I'm David Cusatis, co-founder, chief architect at Range. Something people won't know about me. I was like one of the best Guitar Hero players and Rock Band players. I actually know Fahad because of a friend that I met online playing Rock Band. Worked at large companies like IBM and then a gaming company called Twitch. I was acquired by Amazon, so worked at Amazon. And then ultimately decided to leave the corporate lifestyle to go back to startups and build Range.
Why did you become a software engineer? Take me back to like maybe your high school days when you started realizing that this was for you.
One of my earliest like programming memories was like following a YouTube tutorial to like build a calculator or whatever. And when I went to college, really enjoyed like the projects and the case studies and coursework that we were doing on the programming side, on the math side. There's like a funny story. When I was in college, I also worked at a grocery store. So I don't think many people know this about me. But I worked at Giant, if you're familiar. I used to get yelled at because I was writing programs on paper, on the receipt paper that I would take home to then go type into the computer. But like while I was working there, I was like writing code. So yeah, it's always been just like a pretty consistent part of my life.
What about problems really gets you going?
I think I have a belief that there's like no problem that you can't solve. You just have to break down the problem and reframe it in certain ways. And so like, I think when people say, oh, this is impossible, that's like, motivation to try to solve it in some way. I also like doing hard things in general. I think that's just like a thing that makes me, feel some kind of like accomplishment, right? Like achieving hard things. It's very motivating.
Yeah. Let's go back to like 2018, maybe 2017 years when AI started becoming, a little more popular. People started talking about AI. Maybe like there's like grumblings in the community of like what it was. When did you first find out about artificial intelligence?
I first found out because I was living in San Francisco at the time, and a lot of my really smart friends were working on AI problems at various companies. Like it wasn't, there was a few of these like labs that existed at that time, DeepMind and stuff like that. OpenAI was obviously around, but a lot of my friends were like working at big tech companies, Google, etc., and working on AI in various capacities there. And that's when I started to pay attention to it, because I'm like, one of my friends in particular, like he was just like a full stack, more generalist software engineer. And he's like, yeah, I'm actually going to focus 100% on AI, kind of transitioned to becoming a researcher. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like if this person who I respect a ton, is spending all of his time thinking about this, like there must be something there.
You were in the game before me, but like I don't remember people starting to transition to it full time. Was that then the moment that you then started taking up more interest and started tinkering around with it, or what did you then do?
Yeah, so I think there was definitely like a lot of interest. I was seeing like the first like real application that I saw in like a real company was actually at one of my previous jobs where we were building a streaming website for gamers, and one of my mentors built an AI model that would detect like offensive content. And to me, that was like such an obvious like problem that like was, solved by humans actually. And it was like a traumatizing problem for humans, because humans were manually reviewing like all this content and watching these streams where like all this kind of bad stuff was happening. And it was such like a immediate light bulb where it was like, oh, you can actually apply this in a way that can solve these like really crazy problems that have never been able to been solved before. I started to explore what are things that I could actually do in my day-to-day job. I was working on Twitch chat at the time. Mm-hmm. And for a hackathon, I recall building like a real-time translation. Like one of the first like NLP language experiments that I did was building a real-time chat translation system. So you can actually watch streams in other languages and understand what's going on in the chat. And the mind-blowing thing was just how well it worked even back then for like this like pretty narrow use case. That kind of gave me a lot of confidence and motivation that like, oh, this AI thing is actually going to work.
Was there ever any time where you were like, if you were fast forward to where we are today, right? Real quick, from that time period, could you ever imagine what it is doing now?
I think the applications today are like just so insane. Like specifically the scale of the applications is so crazy today. Like if you go back to like language models like GPT-2, which were 1.5 billion parameters. The leap from like GPT-2 to 3 was like multiple orders of magnitude, right? And so just like the scale of all this stuff is so insane today.
So let's talk about when ChatGPT 2 came out. What was your reaction?
Yeah, I remember like one of my friends told me about it, and he was like, the way he described it was, he's like, this model was trained on all of the internet, which was such like a mind-boggling thing at the time. It was like, you know, how does anyone know what the entire internet is? And you go into like how the common crawl is created, and how like people and researchers have scraped the entire, you know, text of the internet and cleaned it and deduplicated it and just like spent all this work like making the data really, really good. But it was so insane to me to think about somebody took the entire internet and trained a model on it and like what the possibilities could be. At the time, those were really, really good at predicting the next word based on all their things that they've seen, all the tokens that they've seen. But it wasn't really until I think like, you know, GPT-3 that it started to be like a more general application because of the way that GPT-3 like introduced a longer context window. You can do things called like in-context learning. And I think that really paved the path to this like current generation.
Then walk me through around that time, I guess when you had you'd already met Fahad earlier in your career, right? And then you guys got back together, and then you started kind of tinkering around with different things like the Bluetooth Floss dispenser.
Yeah, Bluetooth Floss dispenser is a great one. So Fahad and I think when we first met each other, like I learned a lot about business and I learned about startups from him. And our goal, it kind of always felt like natural that like we would always find some way to work together at some point in the future. I think my goal after meeting him and working with him was to get my technical skills to be at a place where I felt confident enough to go and then start a company. And I think around, you know, 2019 era, like I started to feel that level. I was like, okay, cool. Like I've built a bunch of stuff, seen it at an insane scale. Let's go try our hand at building a company. And so in and around that era, we were just really exploring all sorts of different ideas. And we were really industry agnostic, right? Like, my background has been mostly in consumer technology. So, you know, that was always something I wanted to do again. But we explored things like dental, the dental industry with the idea we had was a Bluetooth connected floss dispenser where, you know, it would send you a notification when you needed to refill your floss and send you reminders. But we also did I think more technically complicated stuff too that we were exploring for a long time. One of the things Fahad and I have thought about is talent and how do you hire the best people? What sort of frameworks and what sort of values do you have at your company? It's why it's at Range. It's such an important part of our culture to, raise the bar and hire the best people. It's because we've thought about this for, a decade plus and how important it is to building companies. So one idea we had was to build sort of this real-time video application. You can think about what a lot of the AI note takers and Gong and that sort of set of tools do today, but specifically for video interviewing. This was in around COVID era as well, when everything went remote. And, the idea there was as you're interviewing people, as you're having these conversations, it could surface insights and follow-up questions to help you understand the best questions to ask to make sure that this person, fits in your company culture, has the same values. So that was an idea we got pretty far on, actually.
That reminds me of the modern day note taker, right? Yeah, exactly. Like we use Fireflies occasionally. It sounds like that. So what happened? Where did you take it, and then why did you decide to pursue another direction?
I think on the technical side and business side, we're very correlated. I think in 2020, the real time language interpretation stuff was not as good as it is today. We're just too early. And so I think that was the big reason we got into it, build a proof of concept. The amount of stuff you had to build to get a proof of concept in that stage working too was pretty high. You kind of had to build this whole video transcription service and basically build a system that serves video as well. It had just done stuff like that similarly at Twitch, or had at least been around teams working on that stuff at Twitch. And so I knew how complicated the video delivery system was and stuff. And I think ultimately we're the technology is not quite there to do this idea.
interesting. At the same time, wealth management, there's so much that goes into it. There's so much human context needed because everybody's situation is so different.
There's actually like so much beyond strictly investment planning that goes into financial planning. There's so many documents and so much like back and forth messages and decision making that happens asynchronously. And I think that was like the moment where I was like, had this realization that even like there's so much opportunity for automation and AI to like play a role that it's like, and no one was attacking the problem at the time. And so that was like really motivating and like a big shift was like the problem space. Like we talked about it a little bit earlier, like any problem is solvable if you break it down in the right way. And I think in the same way of like understanding financial planning, you really have to like break down what goes into financial planning. And it just kind of felt like those things were very achievable with automation.
What were the conversations like before you really started getting into it, talking about how much depth was needed to actually build something using AI in the space?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what came up with the depth piece, it was actually like a pretty core like business decision we made early on to build a bunch of tools and engines, projection engines for our human advisors to use while we learned about the industry and learned about how they use things. I think that's like in retrospect, like something they are talking a lot about AI nowadays. Like a lot of companies are trying to do like very verticalized AI applications where they really deeply understand their customer and their use case and everything like that. And we were doing that from the beginning of the company. And so we built a lot of software for our advisors to use to really understand like what are they actually doing? How do they think about delivering plans? What does that deliverable look like? Can we rethink it? And really took all of that research and like understanding, and that was when you can start to apply AI on it. So you really have to go deep and understand everything first before it makes sense to actually, build with AI. And like that's how you capture that like human piece of it. That's how you capture all that context.
There's a lot of human context needed in financial planning and wealth management in general, right? It's not like a B2B SaaS you can build. So what types of conversations and what thought was put into how deep you might need to go in this space before you even started?
I think one of the things when I think about that question, like comes to mind is you really have to understand what is the human thought process when they are doing financial planning, right? A lot of times humans, when they're solving, like this is a major unlock, I think, in just AI in general, is like trying to model these problems like and solve them like a human would. But using LLMs at various points, right? So like if you think about what does a human do to answer a question that they might get asked by, like a human financial advisor gets asked a question by one of their clients, what do they do to answer that question? Well, first, they're probably going to do some research. They're going to try to remember what they know about that client and their family, and I'm sure that's in a store of records somewhere, right? In some CRM or something. So they're going to read the CRM to catch up and remember things. They are going to maybe do some more research, right? Search Google, look at the tax code, look at, whatever sort of latest regulations are out. They're probably going to do some calculations and scenario modeling, right? And that's where, a lot of the tooling we built in the early days came in. We built the tools for advisors to do all their scenario modeling. And then they're going to synthesize all that information and then respond, right? And so it became very clear to me that like if you build a system that can do those things, you can effectively provide the same experience.
I would imagine that you set out and began and there were lots of roadblocks, lots of times where you made some progress, made a couple steps forward and took 10 steps back, right, in the early days. Is there anything that comes to mind that you look back on when you were really trying to like build out this idea and really build this context and go deep that you can think of?
I think one of the things we did in the early days was we actually didn't go deep enough. And so one of our like original product experiences was basically like budgeting plus advisor Q&A. And like that was gaining some traction. Like that was gaining real traction. Like people were using it, people were engaging with the advisors, but there was like a very clear gap where you needed all this other stuff to actually provide the best experience to the customer. And so you need things like the compound, nature of financial planning. You need things like retirement planning, estate planning, investment management. Like you need all of these offerings in order to deliver the best experience. And I think that was like a pretty core decision that we made. We started out going with this hypothesis that like people are going to want to use a tool where they can just talk to an advisor. And I think we learned that like you really need the breadth to serve your customers the best.
I'd love to hear like the details about like, you talk about how you're using advisors, you're seeing the responses, and you're going deep and you're starting to build this model. Like, tell me exactly how you're doing this.
Yeah, so we took like a very experimental approach in the beginning. We were building out things like the experiments had a varying degree of success, right? So one that didn't work super well in the early days was we were trying to train classifier models on certain questions to route them to the best advisor possible. Turns out you need a lot of data, and we didn't have that at the time. One thing that worked really, really well for us in the early days as an experiment was I hacked together like a IRS tax code search, basically chunking the document, encoding it, storing in a vector database, and then you would take a query and try to retrieve relevant chunks of that document. And I shared it with like one or two advisors just as like to learn and test and see how it was working. And then soon, like every advisor on the team was using this like multiple times a day to answer tax questions. And that was like a really positive signal that like, if you can build the AI system that can just do that search, well, then you can start to answer tax questions automatically, right? For instance.
Yeah, it's basically like you're building the modern day project before projects were a thing, right? Like just giving it all the context, and then letting advisors use kind of as an AMA with all the context given. And then what was like maybe the next step? Okay, so you started giving it context, advisors, you started seeing maybe some mini product market fit internally, right? You're like, okay, there's something useful here. What was the next step after that?
Yeah, so the next step was actually not AI chat at all. The next step was basically building on top of that idea of like, hey, we have this, we can like automate the system using LLMs and these various techniques to like do lookups and stuff. The other big unlock that happened around that same time was models got really good at what's called tool use, and so we had built a ton of tools that our advisors use internally: calculators, projection engines, scenario modeling systems. And so the next step was actually to get our AI to use those tools in the same way that advisors do. The idea was that if we can do this, we can generate plans and create these like financial planning deliverables automatically, right? And so that was like the next experiment of this, where we're building like plan generation basically. We ended up not doing that, so we did like the experiment at the same time, which was let's build that whole workflow to do that like super complicated deliverable stuff. And then at the same time, we also were building, an AI chat with like the same core like set of functionality, right? It can use the tools that we've built. It can use the projections that we've built. It can look things up in our own data stores. It can, search the web if it needs to like understand, maybe more niche things. And then we deployed both of those internally, and we tested for probably about 2 months. And what we realized was like the actual plan generation was probably the most technically complex and the hardest thing to actually get right. The reason for that is actually because of how specific our tooling is. So like our tools are built for range advisors. There's no like precedent for that on the internet anywhere. So like, of course, the models that are trained on everything on the internet are not going to be good at this like strictly internal facing thing. And so we realized that there would be a lot of work to get this right. And, we didn't end up shipping that. But the off-the-shelf models in a more like agentic fashion actually performed really, really well. So like when you would ask a question, it could understand, oh, I have access to this tax projection tool. I can call that and compute a response and synthesize a response just like a human would. And so that felt like a really magical experience, actually. I remember like distinctly like asking it to like roast me about my transactions and my spending. And it was like tell me I eat too much Uber Eats, actually. And so it was like, that was like a really, really interesting experience to see your personal insights, your personal transactions synthesized in a way that like an AI could really understand and like actually make a suggestion. Hey, stop eating Uber Eats and you'll save money. Right? It's like a pretty black and white thing.
On the technical side, I mean, what did you do to ensure that the outputs are actually correct? When it comes to money, it has to be right. When it comes to general day-to-day decisions, it doesn't necessarily have to be right all the time, but we have to get it right, right? So what were you doing early on to ensure that every output followed a certain framework that we could trust?
Yeah, so I mean, the answer there is like, you have to understand what are the things LLMs are bad at and they're bad at, they're really at the core of LLMs. Like what they're doing is just predicting the next token based on the set of words that came previously.
Oh.
And so they are inherently bad at doing things that advisors need to do, like math. So like by having the tools and the calculators that our human advisors have like vetted and have been using for years available for the AI to use, that like substantially reduce like the risk for hallucination, especially when it relates to like, your actual calculations, your actual financial planning. Like we have a whole Monte Carlo simulation that fires off thousands of trials and introduces all sorts of different volatility to project out your retirement scenarios and test the efficacy of your retirement scenarios that our AI can use, right? Like ChatGPT cannot do that.
Why wouldn't we just use off the shelf everything? Like why spend the time getting all this like really deep insight and deep context from our advisors and building like the Range financial planning way when you can just go crawl the internet and just build basic models, right?
Yeah, a fundamental belief that I have about AI is that like for specific applications, you actually want everything to be like very, very, you need to absolutely understand the whole experience and your customers extremely deeply. And the general off-the-shelf models are like not going to do that super well, right? And because like for the example I can go back to is like we have our whole set of financial planning tools, right? ChatGPT does not know anything about range planning tools in its training data. And so we had to teach it how to be a financial planner that works at range, basically. And you do that in a couple ways. Like you can obviously provide in context stuff. You can do fine tuning. But like those are like all sorts of strategies that we implement here. We've also been doing things like training our own models to optimize for specific results and tasks throughout our financial planning workflows, right? And we're able to do that because we deeply understand the way our customers, engage with the platform and the way our advisors serve our customers. And so only because we have both ends of that, you can fine tune these models and train your own models to like outperform even the state of the art on very specific tasks.
Actually, that goes right into what I was going to ask next, which is fine tuning, right? What were we doing early on, right, to make sure that this output was right? Basically, were we fact checking? How did we go about that?
We spent a lot of time with our human planners validating stuff, to be honest, right? I think there's a lot you can do with like off the shelf models to like, there's a strategy called like LLM as a judge that can, a lot of people use that to check the outputs of other LLMs. You kind of have like an LLM checking LLM output. And so you do a little bit of that, but then you also kind of realize like when you're reviewing these things with humans, you start to understand like, oh, there's a perspective that they have that is different than even the state of the art LLMs have, right? It's like some of the feedback in the early days was like, I would not have said it this way. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, how would you have said it and why? And the why is like the most important piece. And it's like often that tells you that like gap of like why is the gap of what the LLM missed, right? So I think just a lot of validation with humans and then, training these models to validate them better than just the generic models as well.
It kind of sounds like the way I'm interpreting it is like helping our model build the subjective side. That you can help it build the objective side, feed it data, feed it real numbers, test it that way, right or wrong, black or white. But when it comes to how a planner might say it, right, how a CFP or a CPA might say it,
specifically how a range planner might say it.
Got it.
That's the key thing, right? Like I think if you look at, there's any number of textbooks you can kind of read to learn like how a CFP should behave, but like there's so much interconnectedness of the range product that you need to understand. Range CFPs may not like agree with the broad set of things that people are suggesting to do, right? Like we're a more tech forward modern company. And so, we might think about certain investment classes differently or make certain recommendations that are slightly different, right? Depending on the customer, depending on their scenario, right? So there's a lot of like, you're right. We cover the objectivity, but then the subjectivity comes from both our advisors and like the specific scenario that their customers have.
Is there any other thing that you can think of that I haven't asked you about when it comes to like really building the nitty gritty?
So when we talk about guardrails, we're talking about really making sure that the system behaves the way you expect all the time, right? And so there's two ways to think about this. There's things called offline evaluations, which are just run when you're making changes and you want to see how the model performs, or if you change your prompts or change different parts of the workflow, like does this still produce the same output that you've validated and approved with human reviewers, for instance. But you've set up like an automated pipeline to check this, right? And then there's more real-time things which happen at the time you ask Ride different questions. And so we have both guardrails in place, right? And so our evaluations that are offline are cover all of the different range personas and households, because the question and the advice you might give, I might get from Rye is probably going to be very different from our customer who's nearing retirement age, and different life circumstances, right? And so we need to make sure for both of those type of personas, the advice is good and as fiduciary standard is correct, is not making up regulations or anything like that, right? And so our set of tests cover that. And then there's like a set of things you do in real time, which are making sure that Rye is not generating any sort of content that it's not supposed to.
Let's like step away from Rye and then like think back on those years of you building and then eventually choosing wealth management as that really hard problem to solve, right? Now with everything you just said, why wealth management?
When we were first starting out, there was a core set of things that were really important to Fahad and I when we were choosing a company and choosing an idea. Number one is that it had to be a technically complicated problem set. We looked at various ideas that were like, oh, this is mostly like a marketing problem or like a sales problem. And that wasn't like super exciting, right? And so what gets me really excited is obviously challenging technical problems. And I think wealth management was like one of these industries that hadn't been disrupted a ton by technologies. A lot of people were building technology to help advisors, but no one was really building like the direct to consumer experience that would effectively, automate a lot of that work that advisors were doing. And so that got me really excited because it was ripe for disruption, super technically complex, and it's also a huge industry, right? I think like that, it was a criteria for us just to want to be excited about idea, to want to start a company in that space. And so wealth management, it's just a massive industry.
How would you describe Rye?
I think I would describe Rye as the financial advisor that I would want to work with.
Why?
Because I don't want to talk to somebody on the phone or go out to dinner with somebody, or I don't play golf, so I'm not going to spend time with you on the golf course, getting pitched investment opportunities. I want something that's like asynchronous, on demand. I want something that I know is like, I think I have a firm belief that like AI is going to be smarter than humans someday if it's not already there. And like, I want the superhuman, the super intelligent, smartest possible advisor that I can have, that never sleeps, right? And I can engage with it the way that I want.
What inning are we in when it comes to how Range is tackling AI?
I think we're probably in like the second inning, right? First inning, maybe. Like, it's still very, very early days. There's a lot of hype around LLMs. There's a lot of hype around AI. I do think that we still have a long ways to go. And I'm a firm believer that like AI is going to like continue to get better exponentially over like the next, 10, 15 years. But I think we're still in the early days for sure. I think things like what I'm personally excited about coming out and seeing the outcomes of are going to be further scaling. Like, we're obviously talking about all these like big data center projects. Like, those are so that these AI research labs can begin to train even bigger and better models. I'm like very interested in that. I'm also really interested in like new architectures of models. The transformers, like the base of LLMs, those are like obviously gone like a super, they've gotten us so far and are like a super interesting technology. But what's like the next phase of that look like? What's the next evolution of language modeling? And there's a lot of hype around like world modeling and things like that, that get me really excited about the future.